The bunker corridor smelled like death and cordite. Sergeant Frank Sullivan stood in absolute darkness, his back pressed against concrete that wept with moisture. 10 feet away, maybe less, a German soldier was screaming in rage and terror, charging through the smoke with a trench knife raised high. Sullivan's fingers found the magazine release, felt the spent drum fall away from the receiver. The bolt had locked back. He'd just emptied his second drum magazine, clearing the barracks. His last drum hung from his belt, still wound and ready, but the German was closing fast. 5 feet away now, Sullivan could hear the man's boots crunching on spent brass casings, could smell the fear pouring off him. In that frozen moment, Sullivan remembered what Lieutenant Hayes had said 12 hours earlier, standing in the morning fog outside this fortress. The lieutenant had called the Thompson a gangster's toy. He had said it would get men killed. He had ordered Sullivan to leave it behind. Sullivan had kept it anyway. The screen faded to black. White text appeared against the darkness. Siegfried Line, Germany. September 16th, 1944. 0530 hours. The image dissolved into gray morning light. Fog rolled across a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien world. Concrete pyramids jutted from mud in perfect geometric rows, stretching toward the horizon in every direction. These were the dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles designed to rip the tracks off Sherman tanks and force infantry into predetermined killing zones. Beyond them, barely visible in the mist, concrete pillboxes squatted like gray tumors on the earth. This was the west wall, the Siegfried Line, 400 miles of reinforced fortifications protecting the German border, 18,000 bunkers, 18,000 graves waiting to be filled. Sergeant Frank Sullivan crouched in a bomb crater watching green tracer fire dissect the fog like a surgeon's scalpel. The tracers were coming from a slit in the earth no wider than a mailbox slot, a firing aperture that marked the outer edge of the fortified zone. To men who had never seen the Siegfried Line, the pillboxes looked like moss-covered rocks. To Sullivan and the other veterans of the 9th Infantry Division, they looked like what they were. Tombstones with machine guns. Sullivan wiped a layer of industrial mud from the receiver of his weapon. The Thompson M 1928 A1 submachine gun was a relic from another era, a gun designed in 1918 to break the trench warfare stalemate of the First World War. The war had ended before the Thompson saw combat, and for 2 decades it had gathered dust in police evidence rooms and appeared in grainy newsreels about bank robberies and gangland massacres. By September 1944, the United States Army considered it obsolete, too heavy, at over 10 pounds fully loaded, too expensive at $225 per unit when the new M3 grease gun cost only $20, too slow to manufacture with its machined steel parts and hand-fitted components. The Thompson belonged in a museum, not on a modern battlefield, but Sullivan loved it anyway. The 50-round drum magazine sat under the receiver like a dinner plate. The finned barrel cooling jacket gave it a distinctive profile that no other weapon could match. The Cut's compensator at the muzzle with its precisely cut gas vents turned the explosion of each shot into a force that pushed the barrel down and kept the weapon controllable. Every part of the Thompson was machined from solid steel billets with the precision of a Swiss watch. It didn't rattle like the stamped metal grease guns. It didn't flex or bend. Holding it felt like holding a piece of railroad track. It was a weapon built for violence and sustained abuse, and Sullivan had carried it through North Africa, Sicily, and France. He had requisitioned it, traded favors for it, and ignored 3 separate orders to turn it in for a standard issue M1 carbine. The supply sergeants hated him. The armory clerks called him a hoarder. Lieutenant Hayes called him insubordinate. Sullivan called it keeping a promise. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes stood 15 feet away, checking his map for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Hayes was 24 years old, fresh from officer candidate school, with a head full of tactics and a notebook full of ammunition consumption calculations. He had been with the unit for 3 weeks. In Hayes' world, war was mathematics. You conserved resources, fired accurate shots at 300 yards, and maintained strict fire discipline. The M1 Garand rifle in the hands of a trained marksman could drop an enemy soldier at 400 yards with 8 rounds of 30-06 ammunition. The Thompson submachine gun, in Hayes' educated opinion, was a waste of taxpayer money that encouraged spray and pray tactics and got civilians killed. Hayes looked at Sullivan's Thompson with open disgust. This was not the first time they'd had this conversation. Sergeant Sullivan, I am ordering you for the 3rd time to ditch that drum magazine and switch to the standard 20-round stick magazines. Sullivan didn't look up from checking the drum's winding mechanism. His voice was quiet, respectful, and completely unmoved. With respect, sir, I'll keep what works. Hayes' jaw tightened. That drum will jam the moment a leaf falls into it. I've read the after-action reports from Italy. Sergeant Morrison tried to clear a farmhouse with a Thompson and a drum magazine. The feed mechanism jammed on the 3rd burst. He died trying to clear it while Germans rushed him with grenades. Sullivan's hands continued their work, checking the drum magazine's clockwork spring mechanism. Morrison didn't wind his drums before the patrol, sir. He tried to wind them under fire. That's exactly my point, Sergeant. The weapon requires too much maintenance in combat conditions. The Garand is simpler, more reliable, and effective at 10 times times the range. Hayes gestured at the pillboxes in the distance. We'll be engaging those positions from 2 to 300 yards. Your Thompson is ineffective past 50 yards on a good day. Sullivan finally looked up. His eyes were older than his 32 years. Sir, with respect, the Siegfried line isn't about 300-yard engagements. When we breach those pillboxes, the fighting's going to happen at 5 feet in the dark, in hallways too narrow to turn around in, against Germans who've had 2 years to prepare ambush points and crossfire positions. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but Sullivan continued, his voice still quiet and respectful. A garand is 8 pounds of wood and steel that's 4 feet long. You can't swing it in a corridor, you can't suppress a room with 8 rounds, and when you run dry at close range, you're dead before you can reload. And you think 50 rounds of pistol caliber ammunition fired wildly into the dark is better? Hayes' voice had risen despite himself. I think volume of fire wins in close quarters, sir. The Germans know it too. That's why they use the MP-40 in their bunkers instead of rifles. Hayes's face flushed red. He was about to respond when Corporal Jenkins, a veteran of the North Africa campaign, spoke up from his position behind a concrete tooth. Lieutenant, I'll bet you a month's pay that Sullivan's Thompson drops more krauts today than all our Garands combined. Hayes turned on Jenkins, his voice sharp with barely controlled anger. I don't gamble on men's lives, Corporal, but I'll note in my report your lack of confidence in standard doctrine and approved equipment. Jenkins shrugged, unmoved. Not lack of confidence, sir. Just reality. The Sarge knows what he's doing. The squad was split. 8 riflemen carried M1 Garands, trusting in Hayes' book training and the weapon that General Patton had called the greatest battle implement ever devised. 2 men, Sullivan and Jenkins, carried Thompsons. Private Davis, a 19-year-old replacement who'd joined the unit a week earlier, looked between Hayes and Sullivan with the uncertain expression of a man caught between 2 religions. Hayes closed his notebook with a sharp snap. We move in 5 minutes. Standard doctrine. Suppress the pillbox with rifle fire, advance under covering smoke, place satchel charges on the rear door. By the book, gentlemen. The Germans may have built these positions, but they're not invincible. Sullivan returned to his weapon check. He had 3 drum magazines, each wound and ready. Each drum held 50 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition. The rounds were subsonic, traveling at only 900 feet per second, slow enough that you could almost track them with your eyes in the right light. But each bullet weighed twice what a rifle bullet weighed. Each one was a flying chunk of lead that would dump all its kinetic energy into whatever it hit. The .45 ACP round didn't pierce armor, and it dropped like a stone after 100 yards. But when it hit flesh at close range, it transferred every ounce of its momentum into the target. It broke bones. It spun men around. It stopped them cold. Sullivan's hands moved with practiced precision, checking each drum's winding mechanism. The L drum was a marvel of clockwork engineering, a spring-loaded feed system that required a key to wind. Most soldiers hated them. The springs were finicky, the drums were heavy. Loading them required patience and a willingness to count clicks while winding the spring to exactly the right tension. Too loose and they wouldn't feed. Too tight and the spring could break. But Sullivan had learned from the best. He had learned from Corporal Eddie Romano that the tactile sensation of winding the drum's key triggered a memory so vivid that Sullivan's hands froze mid-motion. The sound of the clicking mechanism dissolved into a different sound. Typewriter keys. Romano had always said the Thompson sounded like a typewriter. Chicago typewriter, he'd called it, grinning with that cockeyed smile that made everyone like him. The memory pulled Sullivan backward through time. Tunisia, February 1943, 18 months earlier. The desert night was cold enough to see your breath. Sullivan had been a sergeant for only 2 weeks, promoted after the previous squad leader took shrapnel from a German 88. He carried a standard M1 Garand, then, believing what they'd taught him in training, the Garand was the finest battle rifle in the world. Accurate, reliable. 8 rounds of 30-06 power that could drop a man at 500 yards. Corporal Eddie Romano carried a Thompson M1928 with a 50-round drum magazine. Romano was Italian-American, raised in Chicago's Little Italy with a grandfather who'd run bootleg whiskey during Prohibition. Eddie claimed the old man had owned a Thompson, hidden it in a false-bottom pasta pot when the police came around asking questions. Whether it was true or not, Romano loved that gun. He'd requisitioned it against regulations, kept it clean obsessively, and treated it like a religious artifact. The other guys in the squad gave him grief about it. They called it Romano's typewriter. They made jokes about Al Capone and the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Romano took it all with good humor, slinging the heavy weapon across his back and grinning. My nonna used to hide this in the pasta pot when the cops came. Family tradition, Frankie. Sullivan had dismissed it. Get a real rifle, Eddie. That thing's useless past 50 yards. Romano's grin had widened. widened. Good thing I don't plan on shooting anyone from 50 yards away, Frankie. They'd been tasked with raiding a German supply depot, a warehouse complex on the outskirts of a bombed-out village. Intelligence said light resistance. Intelligence was wrong. The squad of 12 men had made it inside the main warehouse before the trap sprang. Germans emerged from hidden positions in the rafters and behind stacked ammunition crates. Sullivan's Garand had jammed. Sand from the previous day's windstorm had gotten into the receiver despite his best efforts to keep it clean. He'd been trying to clear the bolt fingers, fumbling with the action. When 4 German soldiers appeared from the darkness 15 feet away, Sullivan had been a dead man. He knew it with absolute certainty. His rifle was jammed. His sidearm was a 1911 pistol still strapped in its holster. The Germans were raising their weapons. He was out of time. Eddie Romano had stepped between them. The Thompson hadn't cracked like a rifle. It had chugged, a rhythmic heavy pounding that sounded exactly like a typewriter, just like Eddie always said. The muzzle flash lit up the warehouse in a series of strobing snapshots. The 45 caliber slugs hit the Germans like invisible hammers. All 4 men went down in less than 3 seconds. Romano had grabbed Sullivan's collar and hauled him backward into cover, still firing controlled bursts to keep the other Germans suppressed. These old guns don't ask for permission, Frankie. They just get the job done. They'd made it out of the warehouse. The raid had been successful. 12 men went in, 12 men came out. For 100 yards, Sullivan had thought they'd all make it home. The sniper had been hidden in the bell tower of a destroyed church. The 7.9 2mm Mauser round had caught Romano just below the edge of his armored vest, punching through his ribcage and into his lung. Sullivan dragged him into the cover of a bombed-out wall, screaming for the medic, but even as he was screaming, he could see that it was too late. Romano's eyes were already going glassy. Blood frothed at his lips with each breath. Romano's hand found Sullivan's collar again, weaker this time. His voice was a wet whisper. "Frankie, don't let them make you a gentleman." "Eddie, stay with me. Medic's coming." Romano's grip tightened with desperate strength. "Take the Thompson. Promise me. When you clear a room, think of Nana's kitchen." His eyes found Sullivan's and held them. "Promise." "I promise, Eddie. I promise." Romano's hand fell away. The medic arrived 30 seconds later and called the time. Sullivan had sat there in the dust, holding Romano's body, the Thompson, lying beside them both. He'd kept that promise. Through Sicily, through France, through every supply sergeant who tried to take it away, and every officer who ordered him to turn it in for standard equipment. He'd kept Romano's gun and Romano's philosophy. When the door got kicked in, you didn't want a gentleman's rifle. You wanted Romano's typewriter. The memory released him. Sullivan's hands completed the check on the drum magazine. He whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Still keeping it, Eddie." Lieutenant Hayes was watching him with an expression caught between concern and disapproval. "Sergeant, are you all right?" "Fine, sir. You can still switch to stick magazines. There's no shame in following doctrine." Sullivan looked at Hayes and saw a young man who'd learned war from books and training exercises. A good man, probably. Smart, certainly. But someone who'd never had Eddie Romano save his life with a weapon the experts said was obsolete. "I'm fine, sir." Hayes held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. He pulled out a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, tapped one out, then seemed to think better of it and put the pack away. "We're moving out in 5. Standard approach. By the book." The squad began final preparations. Private Davis checked his Garand for the 3rd time, nervous fingers working the action. Corporal Jenkins wound his Thompson's drum magazine, grinning at Sullivan. "Think the lieutenant's going to write us up after this?" "Probably," Sullivan said. "Worth it to see his face when this thing works exactly like we know it will." Sullivan didn't answer. He was checking his equipment one more time. 3 drum magazines, each one wound until the spring had exactly the right tension. Romano had taught him that. Wind them when you're drinking coffee, not when you're getting shot at. The lazy soldier winds his drums under fire. The survivor winds them before the patrol. But as Sullivan's fingers moved through the familiar ritual, something felt different. A tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. A small voice in the back of his mind that sounded disturbingly like doubt. What if Hayes was right? What if the Thompson was obsolete? What if Sullivan had been carrying a dead man's weapon because he couldn't let go of a promise made in grief? Romano had died. Maybe his philosophy had died with him. Sullivan forced the thought away, but it had planted itself deep. For the first time in 18 months, he questioned the weapon in his hands. He checked the drum magazine a 3rd time, which was unusual for him. His hands were steady now, but the doubt remained. Hayes noticed. "Sergeant Sullivan, if you're having second thoughts about that weapon, now would be the time to switch." "I'm fine, sir." But Hayes had seen the hesitation. For just a moment, a look of something like sympathy crossed the lieutenant's face. Then it was gone, replaced by professional concern. "When this goes wrong, Sergeant, I'll be writing a report. I want you to know that." Sullivan nodded. "Understood, sir." Hayes checked his watch. "Time. Let's move." The squad rose from their positions and began the approach. They moved in a tactical column using the dragon's teeth for cover, advancing toward the pillbox in short rushes. The terrain was a nightmare. The mud wasn't just dirt and water, it was a freezing industrial sludge that sucked at boots and tried to pull them off with each step. This was mud that had been churned by tank treads and mixed with leaked oil and antifreeze. It jammed rifle actions and made every movement exhausting. Sullivan moved through it with the heavy deliberation of a man who knew that rushing got you killed. The Thompson weighed over 10 pounds, and with 3 loaded drum magazines, he was carrying close to 15 pounds of weapon and ammunition. It made him slower than the riflemen. It made him more tired, but it also made him ready for what was coming. The pillbox grew larger as they approached. It was a low concrete structure reinforced with steel and covered with camouflage netting. The firing slit was a narrow rectangle barely visible against the gray stone. German machine gunners would be inside, warm and dry, and protected by 2 feet of reinforced concrete. The American infantry was in the open, cold and wet and vulnerable. Hayes signaled for the squad to take cover behind the nearest tank trap. He pulled out his map, studying it as if the paper could tell him something the terrain couldn't. We'll suppress the aperture with rifle fire. Jenkins take 3 men and flank right. Sullivan, you and Davis provide covering fire from here. When Jenkins is in position, we'll advance and place the charges. It was textbook tactics. It would have worked beautifully against wooden targets on a training range, but the Germans inside the Siegfried line weren't wooden targets. They were veterans who'd spent 2 years preparing these positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of dead ground. Hayes gave the signal. The squad stood up to rush the final 50 yards to the assault position. The air ripped open a second machine gun position hidden in a camouflaged log bunker to their right, opened fire with the terrifying ripping canvas sound of an MG-42. Hitler's buzzsaw. The weapon fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so fast that individual shots were indistinguishable. It sounded like a massive piece of fabric being torn in half by a giant. Private Davis, the 19-year-old replacement, took the first burst. The high-velocity 7.92mm rounds stitched across his chest before he could even scream. The impact threw him backward into the mud. He was dead before he landed. The rest of the squad dove for cover, scrambling behind the concrete teeth. Sullivan hit the mud hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. The MG-42 was pouring fire across their position, chipping away at the concrete cover, filling the air with rock fragments and ricochets. Another man, one of the replacements whose name Sullivan hadn't learned yet, took a round to the shoulder. The bone shattered with a sound like a tree branch snapping. His screaming cut through even the sound of gunfire. Lieutenant Hayes was shouting orders, but his voice was being swallowed by the volume of fire. He tried to return fire with his M1 carbine popping up from cover to take aim, but the German gunners were suppressed by nothing. Every time Hayes showed himself, a stream of tracers forced him back down. The riflemen were paralyzed. They couldn't lift their heads long enough to find a target. The Garands were long and heavy. They were designed for precision fire at distance, not suppression in close quarters. Every time someone tried to aim, the MG-42 drove them back into the mud. They were trying to fight a precision battle against overwhelming volume. The gentleman's war was colliding with reality, and the mathematics weren't working out the way Hayes had calculated. Sullivan lay behind a concrete pyramid, the Thompson clutched tight against his chest. He looked at Hayes, saw the lieutenant frantically checking his map again, as if the answer was written on the paper. The officer's face was pale, his hands were shaking. The gentleman's war had met the real world and found itself wanting. Hayes caught Sullivan's eye. He gestured frantically, a series of hand signals that meant, "Move up, suppress the bunker, use that weapon of yours." But even as he was signaling, Hayes pointed at the drum magazine and mouthed the words, "Switch it out." Even in the middle of a slaughter with men dying around them, the lieutenant was still worried about the drum magazine jamming, still worried about following protocol. Sullivan looked down at his weapon. The Thompson was a beast. 10 pounds of machine steel and walnut built with the precision of a Swiss watch and the durability of a railroad spike. The drum magazine sat beneath the receiver, heavy and awkward and supposedly unreliable. He could hear Romano's voice in his memory. The experts call it a toy Frankie. But toys don't save lives in farmhouse corridors. Sullivan made his decision. He reached down to the drum magazine, but not to remove it. Instead, he found the winding key on the front face of the drum. He gave it one more turn, feeling the heavy spring tensioning beneath his fingers, storing energy that would drive the bolt and feed the rounds. It was a tactile ritual, a mechanical promise of violence. The squad was dying. Another man took a hit, this one to the leg. The femoral artery was severed. The man would bleed out in minutes without a medic, and the medic was pinned down like everyone else. Hayes was frozen, his training failing him, waiting for the situation to make sense so he could apply the correct doctrine from the manual. But the enemy wasn't going to stop firing and let him think. The Germans knew they had the Americans pinned. They were probably already moving a mortar team into position to finish the job. Nobody was coming to save them. The tanks were stuck miles back in the mud. The artillery was pounding the town. It was just 10 men in a hole against a fortress that had been built to eat American lives. Sullivan realized that if something didn't change in the next 30 seconds, Hayes was going to order a retreat and the wounded men would be left behind to die. The lieutenant was a good man. He was smart, but he was also young and scared and drowning in a situation his training hadn't prepared him for. Sullivan looked at the bunker aperture spitting fire. He looked at Hayes shouting for covering fire that nobody could provide. He looked at the Thompson. The experts had called it obsolete. The Army had tried to replace it with cheaper weapons, but Corporal Eddie Romano had cleared a warehouse with it and saved Sullivan's life. Sullivan stood up. He didn't crawl. He didn't try to find a better firing position. He simply stepped out from behind the concrete tooth, ignoring Hayes' scream to get back down. He braced the heavy wood stock against his hip, not shouldering the weapon, but holding it at waist level. He wasn't going to aim down the sights. In a phone booth fight, you don't aim, you point, you drown the target. Sullivan racked the charging handle on top of the receiver. The heavy bolt slid back with a solid metallic sound that meant the weapon was open and ready to feed. He took a breath, tasting cordite and freezing rain. 40 yards away, the pillbox aperture was spitting green tracer fire. The distance might as well have been 40 miles. The mud was knee-deep. The MG-42 was sweeping back and forth. If Sullivan went down, there was nobody left who could get the squad out. Hayes was screaming at him to get down, but Sullivan wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about Romano bleeding out in Tunisian dust. He was thinking about the promise he'd made. He was thinking about what Eddie had said. Don't let them make you a gentleman, Frankie. Romano's old gun was about to go to work, and the Siegfried line was about to learn that some obsolete weapons didn't know they were supposed to lose. The distance between the concrete tooth and the bunker aperture was only 40 yards, but in the twisted logic of the Siegfried line, it was a marathon run through a slaughterhouse. Sullivan didn't sprint. Sprinting in knee-deep mud was a good way to die tired. He moved with heavy, deliberate momentum like a man wading through wet cement, keeping his body low and using the geometry of the tank traps to break the line of sight. To his left, the German machine gun in the log bunker was still tearing up the ground where his squad lay pinned. The gunner was focused entirely on the terrified rifleman huddled behind cover. This tunnel vision was Sullivan's only armor. The Germans were so busy suppressing Hayes' gentleman soldiers that they didn't see the street fighter crawling toward their blind spot. Hayes watched him go, his face pale with a mixture of fear and professional disgust. In the lieutenant's mind, he was watching a complete breakdown of discipline. He saw a sergeant abandoning his squad to play hero with a weapon that belonged in a police evidence locker. Hayes knew the statistics. He knew that the Thompson's effective range was barely 50 yards and that the heavy drum magazine was notorious for its feed problems. He waited for the inevitable failure. He waited for the sound of a misfeed or the sight of Sullivan fumbling with the heavy weapon in the mud. He was already composing the after-action report in his head, explaining how a non-commissioned officer had wasted his life on a cowboy stunt. But Sullivan's focus was absolute. The Thompson wasn't a precision instrument. It was a 10-pound anchor, and most soldiers hated the imbalance created by that heavy drum magazine hanging beneath the receiver. Sullivan loved it. That extra weight under the barrel was the only thing that would hold the muzzle down when the world exploded. This was a machine built for heat and violence and sustained abuse, machined from solid steel in an era when craftsmanship still mattered. Sullivan reached the edge of the bunker's blind zone and pressed his back against the cold, wet concrete of the pillbox wall. He could feel the vibrations of the enemy machine gun firing just a few feet away on the other side of the structure. The Germans were right there, separated from him by 2 feet of reinforced concrete and steel. He was inside their guard now, standing in the boxer's clinch where their long reach couldn't hurt him. He checked the Thompson one last time. The Cuts compensator on the muzzle was clean of mud. This device was critical. When the gun fired, the expanding gases would vent upward through the precisely cut slots, pushing the barrel down to fight the muzzle climb. It was early engineering genius turning the explosion of each bullet into a stabilizing force. Sullivan stepped out from the wall. He didn't aim down the sights. Aiming was for targets that were far away. In a phone booth, you don't aim, you point. He leveled the heavy gun at the dark slit of the aperture, looking over the top of the charging handle like a carpenter eyeing a level. He squeezed the trigger and held it down. The Thompson didn't crack like a rifle. It chugged. The firing cadence was slower than the German machine gun's, a rhythmic heavy pounding that sounded like a steam hammer working on a steel plate. The .45 caliber slugs left the barrel at barely 900 feet per second, slow enough that you could almost see them if the light was right. But physics is a trade-off. What the rounds lacked in speed, they made up for in mass. Each bullet was a slab of lead weighing twice as much as a rifle bullet. When they hit the concrete lip of the aperture, they didn't ping off like lighter rounds. They smashed. Chunks of concrete the size of softballs exploded inward, showering the German gun crew with razor-sharp shrapnel. Sullivan walked the fire back and forth across the slit, painting the opening with a stream of lead that arrived with the force of a sledgehammer. He wasn't trying to thread a needle. He was filling a specific cubic foot of space with death. The German machine gun stopped instantly. The gunner hadn't just been hit. He'd been hammered. The heavy slugs caught him in the chest and shoulder, the impact transferring enough energy to throw him backward off his tripod. Hayes, watching from the crater with his mouth hanging open, lowered his carbine. He had expected a jam. He had expected a short burst followed by silence and Sullivan's body dropping. Instead, he was watching a continuous, unrelenting stream of fire that seemed to defy every law of ammunition conservation he'd been taught. The drum magazine just kept feeding. Sullivan fired for 5 full seconds in eternity in combat, sending nearly 40 rounds into that hole. The suppression was absolute. The bunker, which had been a fire-breathing dragon seconds ago, was now dark and silent. But the silence was a trap, and Sullivan knew it. The Siegfried line was designed with interlocking defenses. Every bunker was covered by another bunker. Every position had overlapping fields of fire. As Sullivan released the trigger and reached for his second drum magazine, a steel door on the side of the pillbox groaned open. A squad of German infantry spilled out trying to flank the American who had dared to touch their fortress. They were armed with Kar 98 rifles and MP-40 submachine guns, moving with the desperate speed of men who knew their main gun was down and their position was compromised. This was the moment the experts always warned about. They said the drum magazine was too slow to reload. They said the Thompson was too heavy to swing quickly in a dynamic situation. They said a man alone couldn't fight a squad. Sullivan didn't fumble. He had practiced this reload in the dark until his fingers bled, until the movement was as natural as breathing. He hit the magazine release lever with his thumb, sliding the empty drum out to the side. He didn't drop it in the mud. Those drums were worth their weight in gold. He hooked it to his belt and grabbed a fresh one from his ammunition pouch. But as he brought the drum up to the receiver, something went wrong. The rails on the drum that should have aligned perfectly with the slots in the receiver caught on something. Sullivan shoved harder. Then the drum wouldn't seat. It was stuck, refusing to lock into place. The Germans were 15 yards away now, raising their weapons. For one terrible moment, Hayes's prediction was coming true. The drum magazine was failing at the worst possible moment. Sullivan's heart hammered in his chest. His hands, so steady a moment before, wanted to shake. But Romano's training cut through the panic, checked the rails. Sullivan's thumb found the problem instantly. A small pebble, no bigger than a lentil, had lodged in one of the drum's feed rails. When he'd been crawling through the mud, he flicked it out with his thumbnail, a movement so fast it was almost invisible. He shoved the drum home again. This time it locked with that distinct final sound. The entire malfunction had lasted maybe 3 seconds. To Sullivan, it felt like 3 hours. To Hayes, watching from cover, it looked like Sullivan had simply changed magazines without breaking stride. The lieutenant didn't see the near disaster. He only saw the result. The Germans were 10 yards away now. They'd stopped their rush, trying to raise their rifles and find a sight picture. They were fighting a gentleman's war, trying to aim, trying to be accurate. Sullivan wasn't interested in accuracy. He was interested in volume. He swung the Thompson toward the rushing infantry. The weight of the gun, usually a burden, now became an asset. The momentum of the heavy steel receiver helped him swing smoothly like a tank turret traversing on target. He opened fire. The result was less like a gunfight and more like a scythe hitting tall grass. The slow, heavy bullets didn't pass through the enemy soldiers. They dumped all their energy on impact. A German soldier hit in the leg didn't limp or stumble. He spun around and collapsed as if his femur had been struck by a baseball bat. A soldier hit in the torso was stopped dead in his tracks, the breath driven out of him before he hit the ground. The Thompson chewed through the squad, the drum magazine feeding round after round without hesitation. The dust and smoke from the muzzle kicked up a cloud around Sullivan, making him look like a demon breathed in fog. Hayes watched the German counterattack evaporate like morning mist. He saw men thrown backward by impacts he couldn't see. He saw the sheer brute force of the .45 caliber round doing exactly what it had been designed to do in the trenches of the First World War. Sweep a trench clean. The weapon he'd called obsolete wasn't jamming, it wasn't rattling, it was working with the terrifying efficiency of industrial machinery, but the escalation wasn't over. The German commander inside the bunker complex realized that the outer defenses had been breached. A heavy steel shutter on a secondary firing port slammed open, revealing the snout of a flamethrower. The pilot light was already flickering, a small tongue of orange flame against the gray concrete. Sullivan saw the nozzle emerge, his blood turned to ice water. He was 30 yards away. A flamethrower had an effective range of 40 yards. If that trigger was pulled, Sullivan would be turned into a living torch. He had perhaps 2 seconds to react. Common sense dictated that he should dive for cover or run. The training manual said you retreated from flamethrowers and called in artillery or tank support. But Sullivan knew he didn't have 2 seconds to dive. He didn't have time to run. The only option was the one nobody would recommend. He planted his feet in the mud, leaning into the Thompson to control the recoil, and raised the muzzle slightly. He wasn't aiming at the man holding the flamethrower. He was aiming at the tank strapped to the man's back. It was a 1 in a million shot with what the experts called a spray and pray weapon. It was the kind of shot that Hayes would have called stupid, reckless, and tactically unsound. Sullivan squeezed the trigger. The Thompson chugged brass casings flying out of the ejection port in a golden arc. The bullets walked up the concrete wall beside the shutter, chipping away stone, moving closer and closer to the opening. Sparks flew as lead met iron. Most of the rounds were missing, doing nothing but scarring concrete. But Sullivan kept the trigger down, kept the stream of fire concentrated on that small area. One of the heavy, slow-moving slugs found the gap between the shutter and the wall. It didn't penetrate the pressurized tank. The 45 lacked the velocity for that, but it smashed into the valve assembly, the weak point where high-pressure fuel was controlled by relatively delicate mechanical parts. The valve shattered. High-pressure gas vented, instantly spraying fuel into the air in a fine atomized mist. The pilot light still burning on the nozzle did the rest. A ball of fire erupted from the side of the bunker, a miniature sun that engulfed the flamethrower operator and sucked the oxygen out of the air for 10 yards in every direction. The concussion wave hit Sullivan like a physical shove, nearly knocking him off his feet. The heat washed over him, singeing his eyebrows. The screaming started a second later, a horrible high-pitched sound that cut through the ringing in his ears. Sullivan didn't stop to watch the man burn. Fire drew attention, and attention drew mortar fire. He turned back to the main aperture he had suppressed earlier. The machine gun was silent, but the bunker was still occupied. He had knocked on the door. Now he had to go inside. He signaled to the squad, a sharp hand gesture that meant move up, rally on me, we're breaching. Hayes, shaken out of his paralysis by the explosion, finally got his legs moving. He waved the remaining men forward. They rose from the mud, no longer looking at Hayes for orders. They were looking at Sullivan with the Thompson. They had realized something fundamental. The only safe place on this battlefield was directly behind the man with Romano's old gun. Sullivan reached the blast door at the rear of the bunker. It was locked heavy steel, barred from the inside. But the firing slit he had cleared offered another way in. It was tight, jagged, with broken concrete, and darker than a coal mine. It was a hole that led straight into the belly of the enemy. Sullivan reloaded, putting his third and final drum into the gun. This was it, the last 50 rounds he had. After this, the Thompson became an expensive club. He checked the bolt, he checked the safety, he looked at Hayes, who had flopped into the mud beside him, gasping for air like a drowning man. The lieutenant looked at the Thompson, then at the burning remains of the flamethrower operator, then back at Sullivan. There was no mockery left in his eyes. There was no superiority, no confidence in doctrine and training. There was only the terrifying realization that his entire education on warfare had been incomplete. The book had failed, the mathematics had failed, the gentleman's war was a fantasy, and the street fight was real. Sullivan didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He swung the Thompson barrel toward the dark hole of the shattered aperture. He was going in. The old gun was about to show them how business was done when the door got kicked in and the hallways got narrow and the enemy was 5 feet away instead of 500 yards. Romano's philosophy was about to be proven in the only laboratory that mattered, the concrete tomb where men fought and died in the dark. Stepping through the shattered aperture of the bunker was like walking into the throat of a monster. Sergeant Frank Sullivan moved from the gray morning light of the German countryside into a world of absolute suffocating darkness. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single step. The damp cold of the concrete seeped through his uniform instantly, but Sullivan didn't feel it. All he could feel was the heat radiating from the receiver of the Thompson M1928, a warmth that told him the machine was awake and ready for more work. The air inside didn't smell like the outside world. It smelled of unwashed bodies packed too close together, of stale tobacco smoke and boiled cabbage, and underneath it all, the sharp metallic tang of fear. The Germans had been living in this concrete tomb for weeks, maybe months, waiting for the Americans to come. Now the Americans were here, and the fear was thick enough to taste. Sullivan's boots crunched on broken glass and spent shell casings as he moved down the first corridor. The interior of a Siegfried line bunker was not designed for fighting. It was designed for surviving artillery bombardment. The corridors were narrow, twisting intestines of reinforced concrete built to baffle blast waves and prevent a single grenade from killing the entire crew. The same features that stopped explosions also trapped sound. Sullivan knew that the moment he pulled the trigger again, this concrete box would turn into an echo chamber of deafening violence. He didn't have to wait long. A wooden door to his left kicked open, and a German soldier lunged out, leveling a Kar 98K rifle. In an open field, the Mauser was a deadly weapon, accurate enough to take a man's head off at 500 yards. But in a hallway 3 feet wide, wide, it was a liability. The long barrel caught on the door frame. The German soldier struggled to bring it to bear, his face twisted with desperate determination. The struggle lasted a fraction of a second. Sullivan didn't struggle at all. The Thompson was short, heavy, and balanced for exactly this kind of moment. He didn't raise the sights to his eye. He kept the stock tucked tight against his ribs and pivoted his hips like a tank turret. He clamped down on the trigger. The sound was not a bang, it was a physical blow to the head. Inside the enclosed space, the report of the .45 caliber rounds was amplified 10 times over. It felt like someone had slapped Sullivan across both ears with a wet towel. The muzzle flash lit up the hallway like a strobe light, freezing the German soldier in a series of horrific snapshots. First frame, the soldier's eyes going wide. Second frame, the impacts hitting his chest. Third frame, his body lifting off his feet. Fourth frame, darkness again. The heavy slugs hit him at point-blank range. There was no need to check for a pulse. The .45 ACP round doesn't wound at that distance. It erases. Sullivan moved past the body, his ears ringing so badly he could barely hear his own footsteps. He pressed himself against the rough concrete of the next corner, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. He checked the drum magazine. 5 rounds fired, 45 left. He could hear shouting deeper in the complex guttural German commands echoing off the stone walls. They knew he was here now. Sullivan rounded the corner and found himself looking down a short flight of stairs leading to the main troop quarters. This was the fatal funnel, the place where most bunker assaults failed. The Germans were waiting at the bottom. He saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the shots. A ragged volley of rifle fire snapped past his head and chipped chunks of concrete off the wall behind him. Dust filled the air, choking him, stinging his eyes. A rational soldier would have backed off and thrown a grenade, but Sullivan knew that grenades were unpredictable in these tight turns. They could bounce back just as easily as they could bounce down. He had a better tool. He leaned around the corner, exposing only the finned barrel and the cuts compensator. He didn't fire at a target. He fired at the geometry of the room. He swept Romano's old gun back and forth in a figure-8 pattern, spraying the bottom of the stairs with a continuous stream of lead. The bullets hit the concrete steps and shattered. They hit the steel walls and ricocheted. They hit the iron railing and sent sparks flying. They didn't stop. They fragmented, sending showers of copper-jacketed lead bouncing down into the room like deadly hail. Sullivan was banking shots off the walls, turning the stairwell into a mechanical grinder. The return fire stopped instantly. The Germans weren't being hit by direct fire. They were being chewed up by the debris field. Sullivan advanced down the stairs, firing as he moved. The heavy drum magazine acted as a counterweight that kept the muzzle level even as he descended. Every step was a thunderclap in the confined space. Every spent casing that ejected from the gun pinged off the walls, adding a metallic chime to the roar of the explosions. By the time he reached the bottom, his ears had stopped working entirely. He could see his own breath in the cold air, but couldn't hear himself breathing. He kicked open the door to the main barracks. This was the boss fight. The room was large, by bunker standards, maybe 20 feet across. It was filled with bunk beds, stacked 3 high equipment lockers, and a wooden table where a half-finished card game sat abandoned. And it was full of enemies. At least 6 German soldiers were scrambling for weapons, overturning tables for cover, shouting commands that Sullivan couldn't hear through the ringing in his ears. It was a chaotic swirl of field gray uniforms and terrified faces. Sullivan didn't hesitate. He stepped into the room and held the trigger down. The Thompson didn't fight him. It rode the recoil like a well-trained horse. As Sullivan held the trigger, the gun pushed back against his shoulder with a steady rhythmic pulsing. It felt like holding onto a piece of industrial machinery, a jackhammer, or a steam engine. He didn't pick individual targets. He painted the entire room. He started on the left and swept right the stream of tracers, cutting a waist-high line of destruction across the barracks. The .45 caliber slugs slammed into the wooden bunks, splintering the posts and sending showers of sawdust into the air. They punched through the thin metal of the equipment lockers, turning them into sieves. They hit the overturned table and smashed through both the wood and the men hiding behind it. The physics of the round were terrifying in their simplicity. When a high-velocity rifle bullet hits a man, it might pass clean through, wasting energy on empty air. When a slow, heavy .45 hits a man, it dumps every ounce of its kinetic energy into the target. Men didn't just fall. They were thrown. They crumpled. The fight went out of them instantly. The noise was beyond deafening. It was a pressure wave that vibrated Sullivan's teeth and blurred his vision. The smoke from the muzzle was thick and oily, filling the room with a gray fog that smelled of sulfur and burned powder. Through the haze, Sullivan could only see shapes and the brief flashes of muzzle fire as the Germans tried to return fire. He saw a German officer trying to raise a Luger pistol. Sullivan shifted his aim slightly. Romano's gun responded like it was part of his own body. A short burst of 3 rounds caught the officer in the chest. The man vanished into the smoke. The drum ran dry. The bolt slammed forward on an empty chamber with a hollow metallic strike that sounded louder than all the gunshots that had preceded it. The sudden silence was shocking, like stepping out of a tornado into a still room. Sullivan stood in the center of the barracks, the smoking Thompson hanging from his hands, his chest heaving. The air was so thick with dust and cordite smoke that he couldn't see the far wall, but the fight wasn't over. A storage door at the back of the barracks swung open, but before the door was fully open, Sullivan's eye caught something that made his heart stop. One of the dead German soldiers, an officer by his insignia, had something hanging around his neck. Not German identification tags, American dog tags. Sullivan could see them even through the smoke. He knew what they were before he got close enough to read them. He stumbled forward, his hands shaking worse than they had in the pillbox approach. He knelt beside the dead officer and lifted the tags. The metal was cold. The embossed letters were worn but still legible. Romano Edward J.O., positive Catholic Sullivan's world tilted. Eddie Romano hadn't died from the sniper in Tunisia. Or he had, but not immediately. The medic had called his time, declared him dead, but Eddie had held on. He'd been captured by the Germans, probably unconscious, and left for dead on the battlefield. He'd survived long enough to become a prisoner of war, and he'd died here in Germany, probably in this very bunker system. And this officer, this dead man at Sullivan's feet, had taken Romano's tags as a trophy. The rage that filled Sullivan was different from anything he'd felt in combat before. Up until this moment, the fighting had been professional, necessary. The Germans were soldiers doing their job just like he was doing his. But this was personal. This officer had taken something sacred and worn it like a prize. Sullivan wanted to reach down and close his hands around the dead man's throat, even though the man was already gone. The storage door slammed fully open. A massive German soldier charged out, screaming, desperate, wielding a trench knife in one hand and an entrenching tool in the other. He was maybe 10 feet away and closing fast. Sullivan didn't have time to reload. The 50-round drum was heavy and awkward to change under the best circumstances. In a knife fight, there was no time. He tried to draw his M1911 pistol, but his hands were slick with sweat and his fingers couldn't find the grip. The German was 5 feet away, his eyes wide with the madness of a man who knows he's about to die but is determined to take someone with him. Sullivan did the only thing he could. He used Romano's gun as a club. The M1928A1 weighs 10 pounds. It's constructed of solid walnut and machined steel. It's heavy enough to drive fence posts. Sullivan stepped into the charge instead of away from it. He swung the heavy stock with every ounce of strength in his body, rotating his hips like a baseball player trying to hit a home run. The walnut butt plate connected with the German's jaw with a sickening crack. The sound of bone breaking was audible even through Sullivan's deafened ears. The force of the blow stopped the German's forward momentum instantly. It spun him around like a puppet with its strings cut. He dropped to his knees, the trench knife clattering away into the darkness. Sullivan didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. He reversed his grip on the Thompson, grabbed the barrel despite the searing heat against his palm, and brought the heavy steel receiver down like a hammer. The fight went out of the German soldier. He collapsed to the concrete floor and didn't move again. Sullivan stood over him, gasping for air, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. The adrenaline was so intense it felt like battery acid in his veins. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He looked around the barracks and really saw it for the first time. The room was a ruin. The bunk beds were shredded. The lockers were riddled with holes. Bodies lay scattered in the debris. He forced himself to move. He fumbled in his ammunition pouch with fingers that wouldn't cooperate, pulled out his last drum magazine, and stripped the empty one from the Thompson. The metal was hot enough to burn his fingers. He dropped it on a bunk and slid the fresh drum into the receiver slots, shoving it home until the latch clicked with that distinct final sound. He racked the bolt. The heavy steel cycled smoothly. The sound was the only thing in the room. Sullivan reached down and took Romano's dog tags from the German officer's neck. The blood on the metal was dry and flaking. He wiped them on his sleeve as best he could, then slipped them into his breast pocket over his heart. "Got him, Eddie," he whispered. "I got him." For just a moment, Sullivan allowed himself to feel the grief that he'd been holding back for 18 months. For just a moment, he let himself remember Eddie Romano's grin and his terrible jokes and the way he'd stepped between Sullivan and certain death without a second of hesitation. Then Sullivan pushed it all back down. The work wasn't done yet. He moved to the rear door of the barracks. This led to the command center, the heart of the pillbox. He could hear voices inside, frantic and terrified. They had heard the slaughter in the barracks. They knew what was coming through that door. Sullivan didn't kick the door down. He didn't shout for them to surrender. In the logic of bunker warfare, there is no surrender until someone decides there's surrender. There's only the man with the gun and the men without one. Sullivan stepped back and unleashed a long burst through the wooden door. The heavy 45 slugs chewed the timber apart, creating a jagged hole in the center. He kicked the remnants of the door in and stepped through the frame, the Thompson leading the way. The command center was small, maybe 10 feet square. It was filled with radio equipment and maps tacked to the walls. 3 German officers stood against the far wall, their hands already half raised in the international gesture of surrender. But Sullivan wasn't looking at their hands. He was watching the radio operator who was reaching for an MP-40 submachine gun sitting on the table. Sullivan pivoted and fired a single controlled burst. The radio operator slumped over his equipment, the microphone dangling from his hand, a final transmission cut short, mid-word. The other 2 officers froze. Their eyes went from the smoking barrel of the Thompson to Sullivan's face, which was covered in soot and blood and set in an expression of blank exhaustion. Then they looked at the drum magazine. They could see it still had rounds left. Slowly, very slowly, they raised their hands all the way up. Sullivan held Romano's old weapon on them, his finger resting on the trigger. The room was silent except for the crackle of the German radio and the ragged sound of his own breathing. He could feel the heat from the barrel radiating up into his face. It smelled like burned oil and scorched wood. He had cleared the entire bunker. He had done it alone. He had done it with a weapon the experts said was obsolete, and he had kept his promise to Eddie Romano. Time became strange. Sullivan stood there, keeping the Thompson trained on the 2 German officers, but he couldn't have said if 30 seconds passed or 30 minutes. His mind was blank, running on pure adrenaline and muscle memory. He heard boots crunching on broken glass in the hallway behind him. For a fraction of a second, his body tensed, ready to spin and fire before his brain caught up and recognized the sound of American combat boots. Sullivan, Lieutenant Hayes' voice was raw and breathless. Hayes stepped into the barracks first, his M1 carbine raised and ready. He stopped dead in the doorway. His eyes went wide as he took in the carnage, the shattered bunks, the riddled lockers, the bodies, the hundreds of spent brass casings covering the floor like golden confetti. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He walked slowly through the barracks, his boots crunching on glass and brass until he reached the command center door. He looked inside and saw the 2 German officers with their hands up, saw the dead radio operator slumped over his equipment, and saw Sullivan standing there with the Thompson still trained on the prisoners. The weapon Hayes had mocked just 20 minutes earlier was still smoking, still ready, still working. Hayes looked at Sullivan. He opened his mouth, perhaps to ask for a status report, perhaps to demand an explanation for why Sullivan had disobeyed orders and charged alone, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the Thompson M1928, at the scarred and scratched drum magazine, at the chipped walnut stock, at the smoke still drifting lazily from the cut's compensator. He looked at the gentleman's war lying in ruins around them. He lowered his carbine. Lieutenant Hayes nodded. It was a small, jerky motion, but it carried more weight than any words could have. Then he did something that in the rigid hierarchy of the United States Army was almost unthinkable. He pulled a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes from his pocket, tapped one out, and offered it to Sullivan. In that small gesture was everything Hayes couldn't say. An apology, an acknowledgement, a confession that the rule book had failed and the street fight had won. Sullivan took the cigarette with shaking hands. Hayes lit it for him, then lit one for himself. "Clear," Hayes said quietly. "Clear," Sullivan replied. His voice sounded like gravel grinding on broken glass. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He reached down to the drum magazine on the Thompson and twisted the winding key one more time, giving it a final turn, tightening the spring. He had no idea what was waiting in the next bunker, the next corridor, the next hole in the ground, but he would be ready. Hayes took a long drag on his cigarette. "We're moving out in 10 minutes. Battalion wants us to push to the next ridge." He paused, then added, "I'll be writing a report on this action, Sergeant, a full report." Sullivan nodded, expecting what was coming. A reprimand for disobeying orders, a notation in his file about unauthorized equipment, maybe even a court-martial for putting the mission at risk with a personal vendetta against regulations. But Hayes surprised him. "I'll be recommending you for a Bronze Star, and I'll be noting in my report that the Thompson M1928 is an effective bunker-clearing weapon, despite what the official doctrine says." He met Sullivan's eyes. "I was wrong, Sergeant. About the weapon. About the tactics. About what kind of war this is. You weren't wrong to worry, sir. You were trying to keep us alive." "I was trying to follow the book. You were actually keeping us alive. There's a difference." Hayes looked around the bunker again, shaking his head. "How many—" "Didn't count, sir." Corporal Jenkins appeared in the doorway, followed by the rest of the squad. Jenkins let out a low whistle when he saw the barracks. "Holy Mary, Mother of God." He walked over to where Sullivan had dropped his empty drum magazine on a bunk. He picked it up, examining it. "This thing didn't jam once." "Romano's drums never did," Sullivan said. The squad secured the German prisoners and began clearing the rest of the bunker complex, but it was already over. Sullivan had broken the spine of the position. Hayes stood in the command center writing in his notebook, but his writing had changed. He wasn't calculating ammunition expenditure anymore. He was sketching tactical diagrams, noting firing angles, recording what had actually worked instead of what was supposed to work according to the manual. 1 week later, Sullivan stood at attention in a makeshift ceremony at battalion headquarters. The colonel pinned a bronze star on his chest. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in single-handedly neutralizing a fortified enemy position, resulting in the capture of 2 enemy soldiers and the elimination of 12 combatants." Immediately after the ceremony, the colonel handed Sullivan a second piece of paper, a written reprimand for unauthorized modification of standard issue equipment and disregard of direct orders regarding approved weaponry. Sullivan accepted both, saluted, and walked away, understanding something fundamental about the military. The Army valued results but feared precedent. His success was a problem, not a solution. If every NCO started customizing their loadout based on personal experience, the entire logistics system would collapse. But Hayes understood something the colonel didn't. After the ceremony, he pulled Sullivan aside. "I'm writing up your tactics, not as official doctrine that'll never happen, but I'm going to teach every replacement that comes through my platoon." He tapped his notebook. "When the brass won't learn, we'll teach it ourselves." 6 months later, in March 1945, Staff Sergeant Frank Sullivan found himself behind the lines training replacement troops. He demonstrated Thompson techniques to young soldiers who'd never seen combat. He showed them how to wind the drums, how to bank shots off walls and corridors, how to use the weapon's weight to control recoil. A young lieutenant sat in the back taking notes. Those notes would become unofficial training doctrine, quietly integrated into infantry manuals, never officially acknowledged but present in every close quarters battle procedure developed after 1945. In May 1946, in an Allied interrogation facility, a German officer named Hauptmann Weber was asked what weapon he'd feared most during the war. Weber had been the bunker commander who'd escaped through the tunnels while Sullivan was clearing the pillbox. He paused before answering. "The American submachine gun, the Thompson with the big drum. When you heard that sound in the corridor, you knew death was walking toward you. Our rifles were useless against it. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution." The intelligence officer pressed him. "More than tanks, more than artillery." Weber shook his head. "Tanks we could stop with Panzerfausts. Artillery we could wait out in the deep bunkers. But that gun, in the hands of a man who knew how to use it, there was no defense." By February 1952, Sullivan was a master sergeant in Korea, teaching a new generation of NCOs how to clear bunkers against Chinese forces. During one training session, he used a case study of a single NCO who'd cleared a fortified German position with a Thompson. The name was redacted in the official documentation, but when a young sergeant asked if he'd known the man in the story, Sullivan allowed himself a slight smile. "I was there." On a spring day in 1994, at a 50th anniversary D-Day commemoration ceremony, an elderly man with a cane approached Sullivan. The man spoke with a heavy German accent. "Sergeant Sullivan." Sullivan tensed. Old instincts never quite forgotten. The man saw the reaction and raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I was one of the officers in the command center, the one who surrendered." He paused, struggling with emotion. "You could have killed us. You chose not to. I came to say thank you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of dog tags. "And to return these, I took them from the officer who had them. I've kept them for 50 years, wanting to return them, but not knowing how." Sullivan took Romano's tags with hands that shook worse than they had in 1944. Both men were crying. They shook hands, then embraced 2 old soldiers bound together by a moment of mercy, shown in the depths of horror. The Siegfried Line bunker, where Sullivan made his stand, is a museum now. Tourists walk through its preserved corridors, looking at the walls still scarred with .45 caliber bullet holes. There's a plaque that reads, "September 16th, 1944. Elements of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division breached this position." It doesn't mention Sullivan's name. It doesn't mention the Thompson. But in a glass case in the museum's main room sits a Thompson M 1928 submachine gun with a 50-round drum magazine. The card beside it reads, "Donated by veteran Frank Sullivan, 1994, for Romano." And the history often focuses on generals and maps on grand strategy and the movement of armies across continents, but the reality of war is found in the claustrophobic terror of concrete corridors where a single man with the right tool and the will to use it can change the course of a battle. We rescue these stories to ensure that men like Frank Sullivan and Eddie Romano don't disappear into silence. Because when the experts said the old gun was obsolete, these men proved that sometimes experience matters more than credentials, and that a promise made to a dying friend can echo through generations.